In this lecture, we are going to implement our hold function and also talk a little bit about the don't repeat yourself principle. So we will continue using the concepts that we have been learned so far, and we will also learn how to use functions to correctly apply the don't repeat yourself principle. And of course, we will continue thinking about the game like a real programmer. So let's do that. So this is where we left after the last lecture. So far we can roll the dice and add our scores down here, but there's no way to hold our points and update our scores here in the interface. So let's now do that. So once again, we are going to set up an event listener, and this time it's going to be for the other button. So let's check out which one that is, and it's called button hold. Alright. So let's start by selecting it, and by now you already know how to do that. So query selector and then button hold, and then add event listener. Okay, and we want this to happen on the click once more, and we're going to use an anonymous function, which, as you remember, is a function which doesn't have a name and that we cannot reuse in another point of our code. Okay, so we simply write function like this, and we have no parameters, and now in here we can write our function body. So let's first define what we want to happen as soon as the user clicks the hold button. So the most obvious thing is, of course, to add the current score to the player's global score, right? So once again, I'm using these comments here to first define what we're going to do and then fill it with the code. So add current score to global score. Then we of course want to update the UI, the user interface. And there is another thing that we can and should do right here in this function, so when the user clicks the hold button, which is to check if the player won the game. So let's add that here too. Check if player won the game. So once again, when we hit the button, then the score that we have in that round gets added to our current score. Then we print that number to the user interface, which means that we perform some DOM manipulation, and then after that we check if the player won the game. So let's start right here. So this one should be easy, right? Remember that right in the beginning, right in the first lecture, we created this variable here which stores the scores for both the players. And that we also have this variable here which stores the active player. So player number 1 is 0 and player number 2 is 1. And we can now use this variable to access, to read or to write, in this case, the scores right into this array. So if the first player is the active player, then this is 0, and so we can say scores 0, and then we will have the value in here. And if the second player is the active player, then this is number 1, and then scores 1 is this element. So let's now do that. So scores, and we use the curly brackets to access the variables or to mutate it. And now we simply have to write active player, right? And what will this score actually be? We will simply add the score that the player got in this round to the score that the player already had. So it's as simple as this, so plus equal the round score. And remember that this works because this is the exact same thing as working it like this. So active player equals the score that the player already had and plus the score that we got in this very round score. Alright, so this is the exact same thing, but once again I prefer to use it this way here, okay? So I'm just going to delete this, just wanted to show you that this is the exact same. So I hope that makes sense. Now we want to update the UI, and in order to do that, we first need to know where we have to write our data. So it's here in this ID score 0 for player 0 and score 1 for player 1. So let's do that here with document.query selector. Score. And then we're once again going to use our simple trick where we use the active player variable to construct our string name here, basically. So active player like this, so that we don't have to specifically write score 0 or score 1. And here we just missed this, and now we're good to go. So we have our active player score selected in the user interface, so let's now change the content. And if you remember from the last lectures, we use that simply using the text content method. All right. And what are we going to print here? It's simply the value that we defined before. So we go in our scores array once again, and then select the points from the active player. So if it's the first player, it will be the first element of the array, and if it's the second player, then it's going to be the second element of the array. So let's check out if this is working as intended. So I roll a dice and I hit hold, and alright, here we go. So we have 8 points now here. Now what isn't happening here is that it isn't changing the active player. Because remember, when we hit the hold button, we store our points and then it's the next player's turn. But that's not happening right now. So we have to implement this right now. And you probably remember that we did exactly that in the last lecture, right? Because it's exactly that happens when the user rolls a 1, right? So basically after the user rolls a 1 and after the user chooses to hold his points, it's always the next player's turn. So it's the exact same code, so we can just copy this down here to our other function. Now this doesn't make much sense, does it? Why should we have the exact same code in two places of our application? Imagine that we have to change something here, for example, I don't know, this class name here or some of these class names, and then we also would have to change it up here. So this is very difficult to maintain and it's not a good practice at all. In fact, it's a really bad practice, and that's why there's something called the don't repeat yourself or DRY principle. Of course, as the name says, that we should not repeat ourselves in our code. So what can we do in order to apply the don't repeat yourself principle? You guessed it, we are going to implement a brand new function. And this one is going to be called next player. So function next player. And now we're just going to paste this code here. And we have our function. So it's a function that doesn't receive any parameters and it also doesn't return any result. We simply use this function in order to not repeat our code. So we defined the function and now we can actually use it. So we are going to delete all of this and simply call next player. And then of course the same thing here. So deleting all of this and next player. And just like this, we use the DRY principle. So this is something really important in programming in general. So let's check out if this works. So holding, and alright. So we're back to 0 here. We have updated our score here, and player 2 is now active. And we keep rolling the dice. So we have 5 and 6, so we should have 11 as soon as we hit the button. And alright, it's working. Great. Oh, rolling a lot of 1s here. Yep, so it's working on both sides, right? So let's go back. Now there's only this thing here to do, which is to check if the player has won the game. So let's just check out the rules of the game, which says that the first player to reach 100 points on global score wins the game. So this should be pretty easy, right? So can you guess what we're going to do here? take a moment and try to actually implement this for yourself, okay? So pause the video to try to implement this functionality. Okay, so I'm sure that you got this. So of course we are going to use an if-else statement. So what we have to do here is to check if the score of the active player is now more or equal to 100 points. So once again we use our scores array, where all the scores are stored, and then retrieve the score for the active player and check if it's greater or equal to 100 points. So of course we cannot use just equal to 100 points, because that wouldn't be fair, right? Then a user with, let's say, 105 points would not get the chance to win. So it must be equal or greater to 100 points. And just to check if this works, we are going to display something on our web page, on our game, and we're simply going to replace this player 1 name here, or player 2, whoever wins, with the word winner. So the ID for this is name and then the active player. So document.querySelector. So the ID, name, and then our old trick again. So by now I'm sure this makes total sense to you. So again, text content. And now we will just say winner. And now in order to check this, I'm just going to put this down to 20 so that you don't have to watch me playing the game up until we reach 100 points. So I'm going to put this to 20 now just for testing, and then I'm putting it back to 100 later. So roll the dice, 15 points. And now if I hold, 15 plus 8 should already be more than 20, which is our winning score right now. So I should now be the winner. And yes, it works. Great. Now, what doesn't do much sense is that now it's the next player's turn, right? So let's change that with our else part of the if-else statement. So if the player wins the game, we want this to happen, and only if he doesn't, so if the game continues, then we want the next player to play the game. So let's copy this to here. All right. So let's see this now. $12, $15, okay. Let's say if I can push this even more. Yes, so hold. And now player 2 won the game. So all we have to do now is to actually hide this dice here, I would say, and also remove the active class here from the current player, right? So let's do that, and it's not the first time we did this, of course. So we're doing it right here. So document.querySelector, and it's the dice class. So once again, we're going to change the CSS style. Display. And we are going to set the display back to none. So now it will not be visible anymore. Now, one note about this way of styling our web page and changing the CSS. So it's not the best way to mixture or CSS with JavaScript. So if we have a lot of styles to change, we shouldn't do it this way. So we shouldn't really use the style property all the time here in our JavaScript code, but instead do it the way we did it, for example, down here in our next player function with the toggling or adding or removing classes. So instead of writing a bunch of lines here to manipulate the CSS, we should simply create a class in our CSS and then simply add or remove this class here in a JavaScript. And that's exactly why I created the active class that we have used already. And it's also why I created a winner class. So let's see this. So let me see where this is. All right, so down here. So it's not a lot of CSS, but it's just to show you that it's always a better way to create a class like this instead of doing, for example, these two manipulations directly in CSS. So let's now apply the winner class to the entire player panel in order to make the winner look a little bit better, let's say. So these player panels here. so which are the entire left or right side of the user interface. So let's do that right here as well. So document.query selector, and now the player that won this game is of course the active player, right? So only the player that is playing right now can win the game. So player, and then we use our trick with the active player, and then plus panel. So player 1 panel or player 0 panel. And now we use the class list again, such as we did before, to access the classes that this element has. And now we simply add the winner class, which is the one that I showed you before in the CSS. And what I should also do is to remove the active player class also from this panel. So I'm just going to duplicate this line, and then here it's not add anymore, but it's remove. So the active class. So remember, we have add, remove, and also toggle down here. So remember, what toggle does is to add the class if the class is not there, and if the class is already there, it removes it, which in this case is not necessary because we know that the winner class is not there, so we add it, and we also know that the active class is there, and so we remove it. So let's now check this out. Remember, I'm still at 20 points for the final goal. And here we go. So I won the game, and I'm no longer the active player, as you see here, as the dot disappeared, and also my winner score here is now red and big and bold. So this is already pretty cool, right? We've come a long way with this application and it's almost ready. There's still some problems because first, now if we continue hitting this button, we can still roll the dice, which doesn't make sense, right? And we also have this button here that we want to implement. So if you want to do that right now, then just hit that next lecture. See you there.